Taking advantage of seasonal produce is a great way to add a lot of flavor to any menu. It's great to shop at farmers markets if you can, but take a look at your grocery store and you may find there's a lot of local produce available there these days. I'm going to show you 3 dishes today that are my personal favorites for using up some of the bounty from my local farmers. First up today, I'm going to show you how to make a delicious quinoa salad with roasted butternut squash and apples. It's a dish that'll appeal to omnivores and carnivores alike. Just don't tell them it's vegan and they'll never know the difference. We're going to start by putting our quinoa in the pot. I really like this mixed red, black, and beige quinoa. It looks a lot prettier in a salad. And we're going to add some vegetable broth. You can use water. If you're not concerned about making it vegan, you could even use chicken stock. Quinoa takes about the same amount of time to cook as rice, so about 18 to 20 minutes. What you want to do is bring it to a boil and then turn the pot down covered to a bare minimum so that it just simmers away and the quinoa will puff up. This is a great dish for people who want to pack a little protein in, but it's very easily digestible too. So on goes our lid and we'll get our quinoa set to boiling. Next up, we're going to roast up the butternut squash and onions. I've peeled and seeded and cubed my squash into about 1/2-inch size cubes. That helps it roast more quickly and it means that they're bite-sized when you go to serve the salad. And I've used a red onion here just because I really like the contrast of color. Cooked up red onions are fairly mild in flavor. We're going to drizzle it with just a little bit of olive oil. When you're roasting vegetables, even potatoes, people mistakenly think if they add more oil, they're going to be crispier, and in fact, that's not the case. They end up kind of drowning in the oil, and they're not as crispy. So you want to be pretty gentle with your hand when you're pouring. I'm trying to go super slowly here. There we go. And we'll just give that a little stir. As with many of my recipes, there's always a way to partially make it ahead, and that's if you cook the quinoa ahead of time and even roast the squash and vegetables ahead of time. Then it's super fast to pull it together right before you want to serve it. All right, that looks nice and evenly coated, and we don't have a big puddle of oil sitting on our pan, so that's perfect. I'm going to add just a little tiny bit of salt and pepper, give the vegetables a bit more flavor while they're cooking. You'll notice we didn't put any salt or pepper in with the quinoa because we're going to be adding a very flavorful dressing. There we go. And now we'll put our squash in the oven at about 400 degrees Fahrenheit to roast just until it's tender and starting to get a little bit crispy on the edges. Okay, our squash looks perfectly roasted now. And you can see it's just a few little crispy edges on the onions. That's exactly what we want. And if you check it with the tip of a knife, you'll notice that it's nice and tender. You don't want it mushy or it's going to just kind of fall apart in the salad. So you just kind of have to keep an eye on it. And we'll check our quinoa. That looks great. You can tell when quinoa is cooked when all the water's being absorbed, and it should look, like I said, nice and fluffy. And you can see the difference the multicolor makes there now that it's cooked up. If you use just the regular beige or off-white quinoa, it can look a little bland, so I just really like the contrast. So we're going to work to assemble our salad now. And we'll start by putting the quinoa in our salad bowl. There we go. Sometimes it gets a little clumpy when it cooks, and that's just fine. You can just break it apart. Okay. And now we'll add in the squash. The easiest way to do that actually is to pick it up by the parchment paper. You'll probably notice I really like parchment paper. Mostly it's because I just don't like washing dishes. So you can see here my pan is perfectly clean, a little warm, but perfectly clean, and ready to go back in the cupboard. So I use parchment paper on almost everything I make. Okay, so it doesn't look graceful, but it just works. So now we've got our squash and our quinoa. You can see already how pretty this salad is going to look. Now we're going to get our apple prepared. I should mention too that if you don't feel like making cider dressing, there's some great commercial ones out there, and they kind of look the same, don't they? So don't feel badly if you want to find a shortcut that works for you. And you don't want to peel it because it's going to add some really nice contrasting color. Plus it just adds that crispness that comes with the peel. Easiest way to do it is just to cut around the core. You know where it is, it's in the middle, right? So just cut around it. And if you left any of the little segments that are holding the seeds in, just quickly sneak those out with your knife. They wouldn't hurt you, but they're a little fibrous. And now you can see how easy it is to cut the apple into little pieces. Try and make it about the same size as the pieces of squash and onion so that it's a uniform dining experience. And then just scatter those on top. As I've said many times before, galas or galas, depending on how you like to pronounce them, are my favorite cooking apple for things like salads because it doesn't go brown nearly as readily as some other varieties, and it has a delicious flavor, and it's not super tart, so it tends to play nicely with all the other ingredients. I'll chop up this last bit. If you really love apple, you can certainly add in more. Another option would be pear. That would be really, really nice in this salad. If you're using pears, you probably want to sprinkle a little lemon juice on top so they don't go brown. Okay, so we've got our salad all ready for our dressing. We'll do that, and then we'll get our parsley ready for the garnish. So you can see it stayed nicely emulsified here. Start by drizzling about 2/3 of it on. As I always say, you don't want to overdress your salad and leave everything drowning. It should be a complement rather than the first thing that people notice. And then we'll just give it a little stir. The quinoa will absorb a fair amount of dressing, so in all likelihood you are going to end up adding it all. But if you bring the quinoa up from the bottom as you're stirring, then you'll make sure that everything gets coated evenly. This would be a great thing to serve at a family dinner if you know that you're going to have some people that might not want meat on the menu. It goes really well with roast turkey or chicken. It'd be great with a roasted pork as well. Pretty versatile, and it's also one of those super packable lunch options that I'm so fond of. So now we've got our fresh parsley. Just going to cut the stems off. I really like to use a lot of fresh herbs, as you may have noticed. It's a pretty inexpensive way to make a dish just a little bit more special, and you're adding a little bit more nutrition too. There we go. We'll sprinkle that on. And we've got our serving spoon here, so it's going to be all ready for our guests. A little bit more. There, our beautiful harvest-inspired quinoa with roasted squash and apple salad is ready.
Corn and zucchini go really well together, especially when you combine them to make fritters. I'm going to show you how to make a fantastic Mexican-inspired topping. Vegetable fritters like these ones reheat beautifully, so you can make them ahead, then serve them up on their own or with your favorite grilled meat or fish.
I'm often asked how the process of developing new recipes comes together, and I'm going to share with you my big secret tip. If you want to start getting creative with your flavor combinations, consider investing in these books, the Flavor Bible and the Vegetarian Flavor Bible. They're a valuable resource, and they'll save you hundreds of dollars in unsuccessful experiments. I'm super excited to show you how to make these delicious zucchini and corn fritters. When my kids were little, I couldn't call them fritters. I had to call them pancakes or supper pancakes because the name was just too weird for them. But whatever you call them, they're super delicious. We're going to start by making a Mexican-inspired topping. There's a dish called elotes, which is grilled corn that you would buy from a street vendor, and the topping is what makes it for me. So we've got some sour cream. We're going to add some crumbled feta, kind of equal proportions of that. A little bit of mayonnaise to help it bind together. And I realize this may not be authentic, but we're not in Mexico, so it's okay. And last but not least, a little bit of chili powder. And you can adjust the heat depending on your preference. The fritters themselves are not super spicy, so it's really up to you. And of course, a little lime juice because that's going to give it a real pop of flavor. I'm not using my wooden reamer this time. I'm showing you how easy it is to use a fork instead, if you prefer. All right, there we go. So we're just going to stir that up. And again, you can make that ahead of time and just put it in the fridge until you're ready to serve your fritters. There we go. So delicious. Just make sure we get the chili powder off the spoon. All right, so we're going to set that aside. Next up, we're going to grate the zucchini for our fritters. It'll take about 1.5 medium-sized zucchinis. You need 1.5 cups of grated zucchini for this particular recipe. And of course, you can easily multiply the recipe if you need to make more fritters. Just going to do half of this one. You could use yellow zucchini if that's all you can find, but I find the contrast of the green zucchini with the yellow corn is really pretty. Okay, I'm going to check that now with a glass measure. It's important to measure because your pancakes or fritters might not be the right consistency if you go too heavy on the zucchini or too light. So we want 1.5 cups. That's just about perfect. Great. So we're going to put it in this little bowl and we're going to put some salt on it. And the reason for that is to get some of the moisture out of the zucchini so then it won't make our pancake batter too watery. So I'm using coarse salt here. And an important thing about coarse salt is that it typically doesn't have any iodine in it. So it's a much better salt for cooking with because you don't want that extra flavor of the iodine. We're going to give this a little stir and just let it sit for a couple of minutes while we get our batter ready. So typical pancake batter, you're going to use flour and baking powder. No sugar in this case. So we've got our flour. We've got baking powder. We've got 1 beaten egg. And we're going to give that a stir. Baking powder that we use today commercially that we buy commercially is double acting, so it'll start to make your batter rise as soon as it meets the liquids, and then when it meets the heat, it'll rise some more. I still wouldn't recommend making your fritter batter too much ahead of time. It's a pretty quick process, and it's better to make it just before you're going to cook them up. So now we've added milk, and it's okay if the batter's a little bit lumpy. The lumps will cook out. You just want to make sure you break up any big clumps of flour that are in there. Now we're going to add in some corn. I took 1 really large cob of corn and grilled it up. I just put a bit of olive oil on it and then put it on the barbecue for about 8 or 10 minutes. And then I used this nifty tool, which is a corn stripper, or zipper some people call it, to take the kernels off the cob. You could use just regular frozen corn if you like. Instead, cook it for about 2 minutes to soften it up and drain it well. So we're going to put that in our batter, and that's the equivalent of a cup of corn in there. We've also got some green onions. Another one of my favorite flavor boosters. You could use chives instead if you happen to have chives in your garden. And now we're going to check on our zucchini. And while we do that, we're also going to start to heat our pan because we want it to be ready for the hot fritter dough. So take a measuring cup, that way you'll have even portions. You could use a 1/4 cup or 1/3 cup. Put it in the pan. And then with the back of your spoon, just spread it to make it about 1/2 inch thick. Perfect. Depending on the size of your pan, you should be able to cook several fritters at a time. You can make them ahead of time and refrigerate or even freeze them and reheat them in the oven. That works really, really well. In this case, if I'm doing a bigger batch, I might just preheat the oven to about 300 and put the fritters on a wire rack set on a baking tray to keep them warm until the whole batch is cooked. So we're just going to let those sit for a minute and cook. And while those cook, we're going to get our serving platter ready. It's really nice to present these in a pleasing way, especially if you're serving them to a crowd. We've got some lime wedges here. We've got some chopped cilantro, a little bit of extra feta to sprinkle on top, and then of course our beautiful elotes-inspired sauce, which we're also going to sprinkle on top. So we can see our fritters are bubbling away. I'm just going to give them another minute before I flip them. All right, I think our fritters are done. Let's get them out of the pan and onto our tray. They look so good. These would be delicious with any kind of grilled meat or even as a meal all by themselves with a salad. There we go. And we're going to put our beautiful elotes topping on it. Just kind of drizzle it down the middle. can serve the rest on the side. A little cilantro. Little feta. And we're done. There's our beautiful zucchini and corn fritters.
Freshly picked apples are one of the true delights of autumn. Their beautiful flavor and crisp texture seem a perfect pairing with the changing seasons. Coming up next, I'm going to show you how to make delicious mini apple tarts, which are a great way to showcase apples in a pretty way. And I think you'll find this recipe a fun and easy alternative to making a full-sized apple pie.
I love baking with apples all year round, and this dessert is one of my absolute favorites. Shortbread base, apples, caramel, and salt. What's not to love about that? We're going to start by first making the base for these little tarts by using the food processor. If you don't have one, you can absolutely use my method of grating the cold butter into the flour and sugar mixture and then crumbling it a bit with your fingers. But this is just super fast and easy. So our flour, a little bit of sugar, and then some cubes of very cold butter. They almost want to be frozen, like not quite frozen, but almost, and that will help with the distribution. I'm going to manually just give this a little spin to mix the sugar in, and then we're just going to distribute the butter so it's kind of even on top of the flour. There we go. And I just love how fast and easy this is. We'll give it a couple of pulses, and we want it to look almost like coarse cornmeal, and then we'll know it's ready. Nearly there. One more. I lied. One more still. Okay, that looks perfect. See how fast that is? Some people don't like using food processors because they're such a pain to clean, but they do have their purposes sometimes. So we'll take this off, give it a little tap to get the flour off the top. Then I always like to take the blade out right away just because it's so sharp and dangerous, and get it out of harm's way. So now what we're going to do is put the shortbread base in our tart pans to get ready to bake them. I really like these paper muffin liners. If you can find them, they're all paper, but these are like parchment paper, so things just don't stick to them. So what you'll do is start with about a heaping teaspoon of the mixture in each cup. This is about the only way you can do it to make it even, unless you want to get into a measuring spoon, and that's just way too much work in my opinion. And once you've done your first pass, then you can add about a half a teaspoon, or I would say half a teaspoon to each one to fill them up. And it doesn't matter if they're not exactly the same. This dessert's pretty forgiving. I served this to my book club once, and I think it was inhaled more quickly than anything I've ever served them. They just loved it. Getting down to the bottom here. And we'll tip the rest into this one. There we go. All right, so now you're going to take the same spoon, and you just want to press the shortbread dough down. And you'll have to pivot the pan a little bit as you do that to get into each of the sides. It doesn't have to be super tightly packed, but just enough that the butter and flour and sugar are kind of snuggled together, and then they'll form their typical shortbread base. I'm just going to do the other sides. Oh, I could spin each cup. That works too. There we go. Now this base will go into the oven and needs to cook for about 12 to 15 minutes. It'll get nice and golden brown as the sugar caramelizes and the butter and flour do their magic. And then when they come out of the oven, we're going to get the apple topping onto it, which we'll prepare while they're baking. All right, our crust is baking in the oven for our little tarts, so now let's get the apple filling ready. It's pretty straightforward because beautiful fresh apples don't need a whole lot of work. It's up to you if you want to peel them before or after you cut them. Sometimes I find this easier, and I'm just going to put the peels over here. Some might say that it's a little wasteful not to core an apple in the traditional method, but I find the little bit that you waste just makes up for it in the time saved, at least in my busy kitchen. I do like to leave the peels on for some things, but in the case of a cooked pie or tart, it's better to peel the apples because the skins would get a little bit mushy and discolored and wouldn't look as pretty in the tarts. My grandmother used to peel things with just a paring knife, and the peels would be so thin they'd be almost translucent. It was really amazing. Part of that waste not culture. There we go. All right. So we're going to cut our apples up pretty small because they are little tarts. You could easily make this in a larger pan if you wanted to make one big tart instead of the mini ones that I'm making today. So dice it fairly finely and then have a bowl ready on hand, because what you want to do is give them a little bath of sugar with cinnamon and ginger, our classic apple pie type spices. If you wanted to switch it up, you could use cardamom, that would be delicious, or nutmeg, or a combination of anything of what they call the warm spice family. And the last one here. There we go. So tip it all into the bowl. Great. And now we're going to combine our sugar and our cinnamon and ginger. Noisy in my kitchen sometimes. There we go. Just give it a little blend and then sprinkle it on top. Do about half at a time. Give it a stir. This does two things. One, it flavors the apples, and two, it does insulate them a little bit from browning while you're waiting. Do the rest of it now. Great. And we'll stir that in, and then we're going to add a little squeeze of lemon juice, which will help to pop up the flavor, and again, add with the anti-browning. So just a little squeeze. Looks like I'm getting more on the counter than the apples, but not really. There we go. And one more stir. And now we're ready until our crust is baked. Time for a cup of tea, maybe. All right, we've baked up our tart crusts. Don't they look good? You don't have to worry about the little holes in them. It'll all get filled in with the apple mixture and, of course, our caramel sauce. So now we'll quickly just distribute the apples. One big spoonful for each. You can hear them sizzle as they meet the crust. I try not to bring up too much of the liquid from the bottom of the bowl because we want the caramel sauce to be what predominates. Each time I do this, I wonder if I'm going to be able to distribute it evenly, but it always seems to work out. 4 more to go. I call this bowl hockey, when you have to take a few swipes to get down to the bottom of the bowl. There we go. Sneak one over here. And just poke them down if they're sticking up. You kind of want an even layer. There we go. Now we're going to add caramel sauce. You can make your own or purchase caramel sauce like sundae topping is just great. I like to use a cookie scoop because it's an easy way to fill them. 1 generous spoonful in each compartment. The combination of apple and caramel is just so, so good. If you have a lot of squeezy bottles, you could also do the sauce that way, and that would be super fast and easy. And don't worry about it not being too even over the apples. As it bakes, it will bubble up and fill them. There we go. It takes about 3/4 of a cup of sauce to do the whole pan. All right, and the last finishing touch is finishing salt. I like to use Maldon salt because it's in little flakes, but you could use fleur de sel or even a regular coarse salt. And you just want a tiny sprinkle so that as the sweet of the caramel hits the palate and the taste buds, you'll also get that little tiny bit of saltiness. And back into the oven for about 20 minutes, and then they'll be ready to enjoy. All right, our tarts have come out of the oven and they've had a chance to cool. You need to let the caramel sauce firm up again before you take them out of the tart liners. And aren't they just the cutest little things? They're so, so, so pretty. These are best served, I would say, cold out of the fridge because they are a little gooey thanks to the caramel sauce, but it's worth every finger-licking moment. Put a few here on the plate. You can see the shortbread on the bottom, and then our caramel has nestled in around the apples. And it is all the joy of a piece of pie in a perfect bite-sized form. There we go, and one more. There we go, caramel apple tarts ready to be devoured. Whether you decide to make this beautiful roasted squash and apple quinoa salad, zucchini and corn fritters, or apple shortbread tarts, enjoy all the bounty of the season.